Hey everyone. Just a fair warning before we get started on this episode. We will be discussing child sexual abuse. So if this is something that is going to affect you negatively, then feel free, obviously, to skip this episode. All right, here we go. Hey, welcome to Ed, a podcast about the teaching life. This is Conversation 73, and I'm your host, Shane Lawrence. Ed is a proud member of the Alberta Podcast Network, powered by ATB. And this week, I am joined by teacher and counselor, Dani Bostick.
Hey.
Hi, Dani. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, this is exciting. I've been watching your stuff online for a while, and it's I don't know. I usually when I get pulled into, asking someone for a conversation, it's because of some sort of pedagogical approach. But you're doing something a little bit different, and that really captured my eye. But maybe let's just back it up a little bit. What do you do in the educational world? Like, what's your assignment currently?
So right now, I'm a Latin teacher and lead mentor at a public high school in Winchester, Virginia. So we're a small town. Our school has about 1,300 kids. Most of them qualify for free or reduced lunch, and we also have a very high population of Latino students and students whose first language is not English.
So that's a challenge.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely a challenging situation, just because not all of the kids have the same resources. And then, of course, teaching Latin, I mean, that tends to attract pretty much one kind of student, your affluent college-bound student. So one of the things I've been working on is sort of desegregating my program so that Latin can be for everybody. I like the demographic of my classroom to mirror the school population versus just having it be some sort of exclusive thing.
Yeah. I mean, Latin is kind of a weird thing. Like, we don't have Latin pretty much at all in Canada.
Oh.
Yeah. As far as I know, I've never encountered it ever. So what's I'm going to sound like one of your students probably, but what's the point of Latin?
What's the point of Latin?
Yeah.
It's like time traveling. You get to read the words of people who lived 2,000 years ago. So instead of just learning about history, you get to read it in the voice of people who are no longer here. And one advantage for students, since it's a dead language, is I tend to get a lot of students who want to take a language but are either too shy or maybe have some sort of, they perceive that they're just not good at languages. But Latin tends to be something that everybody can do. And it helps students, with their English skills. We do quite a bit of grammar. I don't know what things are like up in Canada, but we tend to be very grammar light now with our English standards. So kids tend to learn English a lot better, and then they go on to learn other languages just a lot more easily. So I mean, there's a lot of advantages to Latin. And it's also just fascinating. I mean, it's just a really fun class. People joke that in French you learn how to say yes and no and how are you. In Latin, you get 10 ways of saying kill before you learn how to say hello. So it's something, it just fits a certain kind of kid and certain kind of personality.
Yeah. I mean, I am an English teacher, so I've always appreciated learning sort of the deeper roots of the language. So, I mean, for me, it would just be pure not entertainment, but just edification, I guess. Just, I love to learn stuff. So that's interesting. But I know there's probably a lot of people out there just thinking like, why would I have to learn that? But that's I like how you place that. It's sort of steeping yourself in the history, actually being there and using the history in a way.
Yeah, it's very cross-curricular too. I mean, the Romans were very, very innovative. So sometimes it's easier to learn about certain topics when they're not presented in like a math classroom or a science classroom. So you can work a lot of cross-curricular content in there. And you can also talk about a lot of issues that are affecting us today without it being as controversial, because you're saying, okay, what did the Romans do? How did this work back then? What do we do now? So we just recently talked about, for example, mass incarceration, because Romans didn't use incarceration as a punishment. Now, I mean, they executed way more people than we do now. But, it's just an interesting conversation on crime and punishment. And doing it through the lens of history makes it a little bit easier for kids to speak freely and express ideas, because you're not judging anything that's happening right now. It's not a current debate. You're just saying, hey, what do you think of how this used to work? And, through that, you can really I hate to use the word relevance, but you can, kids make connections to what's happening now, and they can sort of think about things in a different way.
Yeah, I think. So, would you say that you have like a real bent towards like justice and that kind of thing? Like,
Oh yeah, absolutely, for sure. And for me, I mean, social justice, just on a very literal level in my classroom, is does everybody have equal access to their education? So, I mean, a lot of Latin programs, not everybody does have access to it. So, I mean, just on the very basic definition of social justice, does everybody have equal access to a certain, benefit or commodity? I'm very invested in making sure that my class is accessible to everybody. And then, once kids are in there, I don't want it to be, like a secret alt-right club or anything like that. I definitely want to make sure everybody's comfortable and feeling seen and heard. Because I think a lot of times, it's easy to skirt around difficult issues or whitewash things like slavery to make it sound not as bad. And, that just doesn't do anybody any favors. But depending on your background, there's certain ways and content can be delivered where it's not just not accessible to everybody, but it can be offensive and marginalizing. So I'm definitely approaching what I do from a social justice perspective.
and it sounds like you really have a focus on sort of having difficult conversations as well.
Yeah, I mean, kids need to learn how to think for themselves, and I'm not there to tell them what to think, but they need to know what they believe and why, and that can evolve and change over time. But I think shying away from certain conversations doesn't do anybody any favors. And you're also sort of implying, hey, if we don't agree, we might not be able to get along. But really, they need to see, oh, okay, I might disagree about this, with my classmate, but look how we can have a disagreement and still be civil and respect each other. So I think there's value in having some difficult conversations in class, but you have to lay the groundwork first, just so it's a safe environment and people have expectations and standards in the way they're discussing issues.
Right. So what kind of groundwork do you have to lay out when you're going to have these conversations?
Yeah, so I mean, we have we establish group norms. So I mean, depending on the class, sometimes they evolve naturally. I've had classes where I don't need to be as explicit, but typically we want to make sure people feel safe and people feel heard, and they understand that the point of a conversation is to share ideas and not debate. Because I think when you get into debating or trying to convince people of your perspective, that's where you can sort of run into conflicts or situations can get out of hand pretty quickly. So, I think to just make sure it's very clear from the beginning that my role is not to convince them of anything. I'm there to facilitate a conversation, and for them to know that when they're sharing, they need to have positions that they can defend. On the other hand, if they're responding to somebody, they shouldn't be putting somebody on the defensive or arguing. So I think what a lot of people don't understand is kids and adults too don't always have a template or roadmap for how to navigate that kind of conversation. But once you work through it, especially if the students feel like there's buy-in, like, hey, I've helped establish these rules and these are guidelines I'm committed to because some of these ideas were mine, the conversations just go a lot more smoothly.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to dig a bit deeper into that too, because I think one of the things that stands out going through your online presence is, well, I mean, the very first thing it says in your Twitter feed is disrupting shame and silence. Usually, you see something quite different on a bio. So I'm going to assume that that's sort of one of the most important things to you.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and it kind of goes into the difficult conversations or awkward conversations. I mean, there's just certain things people don't want to talk about or mention, and I don't just mean in a classroom. And for me, the issue I'm probably most passionate about is just raising awareness about child sexual abuse, because I was a victim of child sexual abuse as a child, and it never even occurred to me to tell anybody. It was just such a taboo topic. I just thought, wow, nobody's going to believe me. This is so awkward. How do I even bring it up? Mm-hmm. So I finally reported my childhood perpetrator as an adult in 2014. And when I went and spoke with the police, after we'd gotten through the information, we had done a pretext call with the perpetrator, and they said there was enough information to file charges. They said, well, we're going to have to do some media coverage of this since he's still around children. The community needs to know, but don't worry, you'll just be victim A. And something about that just really didn't sit well with me, because I hadn't done anything wrong, and I didn't like going and dealing with something so difficult and finally giving voice to this awful problem I had had as a child, this awful crime, and then losing my name. So that really got me thinking about a lot of things in a much different way. So when I talk about disrupting shame and silence, I mean, I think a lot of injustice and a lot of oppression, not just sexual abuse, but other kinds of oppression happen because people don't speak up. They sit quiet and accept it. So I think, in where people can and where it's safe to, it's important to speak up and not just be a bystander and not protect the oppressor with silence.
So how do you do that in the classroom? What does that look like?
Well, I mean, I want my students to know that that their voice matters. So, I mean, I'm far less activisty than I think people would imagine, from my Twitter presence. I mean, that's my voice and that's, my personal platform. But, when we talk about topics, it's important for kids to know that their voice matters. And sometimes their voice is not a literal voice. My kids do most of their communication and sharing through writing. Everybody has a composition book, and I respond to every single thing that the kids write. So any day that a child writes, they're not getting their composition book back with nothing on it. I mean, I'll mark it, I'll ask questions, I'll give them feedback, because they need to know that what they say and what they think really, really matters. Because I think a lot of times, especially in school, the bell rings, kids get up and go. I mean, they don't feel like they have a lot of choice. They're legally required to be in school, and there's just not a lot of sense that what they think and what they believe and what they prefer matters. So I think it's really important to give kids a sense of that, even if it's just a mundane topic like, hey, we're learning adjectives. What did you think about this? What would make this easier for you? Yeah. Versus go home and study so you can learn this better. They need to learn how to share their experience and articulate their experience, even in matters that might just seem mundane.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, I'm trying to figure out how to come at this here. This is obviously something that clearly and obviously it's important to you and important to educators. I mean, what kind of equipping sorts of advice would you be able to give to listeners, to other educators?
In terms of facilitating conversations about...
In terms of facilitating conversations, perhaps even just dealing with child sexual abuse. I mean, this is something really important to you. So, I mean, because we know... We have kids walking in the classroom who are, who have had this happen, who are having this happen.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's an interesting time for teachers, because now I think more than any other period of time where I've taught, I mean, there's such an emphasis on student voice, student choice. You have a lot of information out there on trauma-informed teaching. And I think teachers have a lot of information, but sometimes it's just really hard to put into practice something that's going to make a difference for a kid. So one of the things I've noticed sometimes is that you have a lot of educators who have the sense that they can make a difference in the student's life, but they don't quite know how to go about doing that. So I think first and foremost, it's essential that teachers operate within certain boundaries no matter what they do. And it's possible to make a difference and be there, for students who might be struggling, while maintaining really appropriate boundaries. Because fundamentally, our role is we're educators. I was a mental health counselor in Colorado, and when that was my job, my role was very different. But I think sometimes teachers don't know where to start, so they don't touch certain topics at all. Or they go in the other extreme and sort of operate outside their lane and are, taking on roles that they're not necessarily, qualified to assume.
All right, we're going to get back to my conversation with Dani in just a sec. But first, I want to tell you about Back to School Again. It's a podcast about people who made the decision in midlife to return to school, either to pursue a new type of career, to augment their current career, or just for the sheer challenge of learning something new. It chronicles the personal journey of host Katrina Ingram, who is back in school after more than 2 decades away. It features conversations with a wide range of midlife learners who are currently enrolled in post-secondary studies or have recently completed a post-secondary degree. The podcast shares their stories, what brought them to this moment, how they balance their responsibilities in school, work, and family, and where they hope their education pursuits will take them. The podcast is available now in Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and most other podcatchers, and you can find the episodes and show notes at backtoschoolagain.ca. Back to School Again is presented by Norquest College and is an affiliated member of the Alberta Podcast Network. Find it and our other affiliates at albertapodcastnetwork.com. All right, let's get back to me and Dani. So, I mean, how can we better equip than teachers? I mean, I had an experience. It wasn't anything to do with trauma, but it just something. A student shared something fairly important with me, and we had some training on it. But I mean, I kind of froze up in the moment. Not froze up, but my brain kicks into gears. Like, what's my training? What am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to say? How do I make this work? So. It was a little bit scary in the moment. I kind of acted like an idiot, and I apologized to the student later. I was like, sorry, I was kind of a dummy there. But anyways.
Yeah, it's definitely really tricky. I mean, the bottom line is, we kids spend more time in school than they do at home a lot of the time, and they have more access to their teachers than sometimes parents or guardians. So, I mean, one thing teachers need to keep in mind is that if somebody discloses something that needs to be reported, that is a gift. I can't say how many teachers I've talked to who would say, oh my gosh, my worst nightmare would be that I would have to report something. I mean, really, it's a gift if you're able to report something. It's not a teacher's job to investigate. It's not a teacher's job to make a judgment. But if a student feels safe enough to disclose, I mean, that is a gift. And we need to be very, very good stewards of disclosure. So I think just kind of reframing, topics like, disclosure, or just having to face that, child sexual abuse is out there. And the odds are we will come across many students each year who have, experienced some sort of household trauma, or, child sexual abuse, for example, witnessing domestic violence. And, if we come to know that through student disclosure, I mean, that means that we've created a safe environment, and that means that, we've been an asset to that child, that they felt safe telling us. So it's not a bad thing if you have to report. It's an opportunity to intervene. It's an opportunity to, get a child on a better path. I kept my secret really hidden. I mean, I was an excellent student, solid middle-class family. I don't believe anybody even suspected that I was being abused, and I was very invested in appearing to be just like my classmates. So, when a child takes that risk and reveals something, and it could be a verbal disclosure, it could be acting out. I mean, there's lots of ways that kids disclose, but it's important for teachers to know that they have an obligation and responsibility, and it's not a burden. It's an opportunity, and it's really not as difficult as teachers think, because it's not their job to investigate, evaluate, or judge. They just have to let somebody know who can then come in and assess the situation.
Right. Well, I mean, speaking as someone who's gone through this kind of trauma, I mean, what are some things that other teachers should know if a student discloses? I mean, obviously, we need to. If it requires legal action, then we have to report it. That's the easy part. But what about from the relational aspect? I mean, what does that moment look like where a student says, I've been sexually abused?
Yeah. And I mean, honestly, disclosure like that's probably going to be really rare. I mean, I think what's more common is, teachers will have this kind of sinking suspicion, and they'll just have more and more evidence that they're thinking, oh my goodness, this isn't just some gut feeling. This is actually something is going on here. So whether it be just the teacher coming to that conclusion through warning signs, or a student actually disclosing, I mean, it's really, really important that the student feel heard and seen and understood. And one technique that is just so easy is just to repeat back what you've heard. And that doesn't require making judgments. That doesn't require any, special skill at all. Just thanking the student for sharing and saying, wow, so things are really bad for you at home right now. And, typically, students will, they might talk more, but I think really there's not a lot a teacher can do in that moment other than really help the student understand that they've been heard, because there's nothing worse than disclosing or thinking an adult is going to help you and then hearing that they haven't or they won't or that they don't believe you. So I think it's really important for the student to regain some sense of power and autonomy, and for the teacher to make them understand that, yes, I've heard you, I see you, and then involve them. Just say, hey, what you've disclosed is very serious, and this is, I care about your safety, and this is something I need to report. And, one thing I've learned in other contexts is a really good way to do that is like, hey, let's go down and talk to so-and-so together, or here's what's going to happen next. Would you like to come with me? And that way they're not cut out of the loop, and they do understand that they have some allies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, okay. And something, speaking of sort of the terminology of like allies, and you mentioned earlier that you yourself were reduced to victim A.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a big impact here on, I don't have the right vocabulary, so I'll say it again. There's a big impact on the victim's sort of identity.
Yes.
So, I mean, how do you navigate that? How do you help students restore that? Or does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, every, whether you're a child or an adult, if you're facing something horrible, especially if sexual violence or, in the case of children, child sexual abuse, we have a lot of ideas of what that means. So even the way we use the word victim tends to be very disempowering. I mean, we almost use it as a slur. Oh, look at her playing the victim. Right. I mean, essentially, victim is just somebody who's been harmed by a crime. And I think it's really, really important for kids to know. And I mean, this is something, like CNN 10 is a great program. I mean, there's ways that, depending on the news cycle and things coming up, that teachers can just emphasize, hey, there are bad things that happen in the world, and it says nothing about the people that, have been harmed by these acts and these actions. So I think just being careful about the way we talk about, victimhood in general, even in casual conversations, can already go a long way, because there's a reason people have certain assumptions about victims of child sexual abuse. Oh my gosh, they're such a mess, or they're unstable. I've been to trainings on trauma-informed teaching where they'll start talking about school shootings, and there's no research to support that being a victim of child sexual abuse or sexual violence makes you a higher threat to your school community in terms of shootings and things like that. But right. It's something that's kind of just sort of reveals a lot of bias and just negativity towards people who've experienced something very, very difficult. So I mean, I think the first step is just to sort of just correct any assumptions about what it means to be a victim. If you've been the victim of a crime, there's nothing wrong with you. You've not done anything wrong. Big moment for me was I was still anonymous. I was still very ashamed. I didn't want people to know, I was victim A. And an acquaintance of mine called, and we were talking on the phone. I was in Colorado. She was back in Maryland, and she said, they're saying you're the victim. And I was mortified. I was like, oh my gosh, nobody can ever know this. And then, a split second, I thought, at least they're not saying I'm the perpetrator. So I think it's important, when we talk about crime and, things like Kavanaugh hearing, we don't need to judge the veracity of the allegations, but I think it's important to be compassionate, because we're not detectives. It's not our role to make evaluations. And to, we're not the ones sentencing people to prison. We're just there to essentially to listen and be good humans. So I think that's really important, to make sure that we afford, victims of crime, particularly sexual abuse and those types of crimes, just some dignity in the way we talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that that's, just a simple way that we can, support people in the classroom. I mean, just assume you assume there's victims of child sexual abuse in your classroom. And, when you talk about things, is everybody in the classroom going to feel safe and supported by what I'm about to say? And I
Right.
think that's just a really good standard.
Now, you mentioned earlier about like trauma-informed teaching. So trauma-informed teaching, is that a method of teaching, or how does that work?
Well, I think, sort of like project-based learning or student-centered teaching. I mean, there's certain phrases that get tossed around. And
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, one thing I've noticed with, trauma-informed teaching is there's not always a clear definition of what trauma is and what trauma-informed teaching would entail. But I mean, I think the first step is that teachers need to understand that students are facing situations outside of the classroom that are affecting the way they learn. Every single teacher needs to understand that. I mean, it could be domestic violence, it could be poverty, it could be some kind of abuse. And teachers need to understand that trauma affects everybody. I mean, some people suffer disproportionately from it. I mean, like poverty can exacerbate, the effects of trauma, but I mean, I think trauma-informed teaching starts with just an awareness that kids are facing situations outside of the classroom that are going to affect the way they learn, the way they behave, and the way they interact. So I think just approaching, our practice from that perspective can already change a lot, where it's not a specific method where, oh, I need to come in and do X, Y, and Z. It's really not a protocol-based thing.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, some of what I've seen is where the emphasis is placed on so strongly on relationships and understanding that it almost gives the impression that, okay, if Johnny's having an outburst in class, I need to ignore it and just understand that, Johnny is experiencing trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Because for every child that's experiencing trauma by having an outburst, there is a child who's going to be experiencing trauma by being shut down. So, and in that case, you could have somebody who's just suffering in silence, where maybe that outburst is reminding them of the time, their dad blew up on their mom and hit her, So I think no matter what we do, it all starts on, just having an understanding and having some empathy that students are experiencing things outside of the classroom that are going to have an impact on, their behavior, their interactional style, and their education. But then also coming from a perspective that our classroom needs to be safe for every single student. Every single student. And, a student shouldn't have to disclose to us and overexpose themselves in order to get our best. So I think things that benefit all students are, predictability, consistency, orderly environment. I mean, these are things that benefit a child who's never experienced trauma, but can really kind of just be really help a kid who's coming out of a chaotic environment, like I was, just feel safe. Like I know what to expect. When X happens, I can expect Y. Because I think one thing that can happen when we think about trauma is like, oh, my kids are going through so much, I need to be understanding. It's important to be understanding, but it's also important to be, consistent and fair. And I think the consistency and fairness are classroom, conditions that can help people who've experienced trauma have some sense of control. It can help them feel, less scared. Okay, I can expect this. Here's our routine. Here's our procedure. When I'm in this classroom, I know what to expect. Because when you're experiencing trauma, if it's going on, in your household, you don't know what to expect, and you don't have any control or sense of power. And so I think that that's something that teachers often overlook, that, just even simple classroom procedures, predictability, those types of things can really go a long way for a student who's experiencing something, traumatic at home.
I like that. Just sitting here processing. Yeah. So this is like probably one of the heaviest sorts of discussions I've ever had. I just having to let it kind of sit on me for a second. Wow. So providing a safe environment, providing predictability, how does relationship play into all this sort of thing? Because I mean, we're dealing with kids who've got broken relationships and who might just very well be afraid of, closeness. I mean, how do you bridge that gap, or do you, or should you?
Yeah, and again, I mean, I think sometimes teachers overthink it. I mean, I've known of teachers who, are giving out cell phone numbers and buying kids food. I mean, typically, if you're in a school district, your district has, policies and procedures in terms of communication outside of, official school email. They'll have policies on, just basic fairness, not playing favorites. I mean, and that's all designed, to protect kids, because our bad boundaries normalize grooming behavior, where even if we're not pedophiles, if we are treating certain students differently, I mean, that can open them up to the next teacher who maybe doesn't have a good intent. So I think no matter what we do, we need to be very familiar with our school district policies and operate within those parameters. And nothing we do should be similar to grooming, because grooming involves playing favorites, making kids feel really special. All of our kids should feel special. A kid who's experienced trauma and a kid who hasn't. Now, that said, I mean, for a kid who's experienced trauma, one thing that can make, a big difference for them is, a caring adult. And it's hard to care for kids sometimes who are either, so needy, you feel like they're constantly shadowing you, or, so distant that, you really can't make a connection. But I think if we just approach kids from just a stance of unconditional acceptance, I mean, that can go a long way, where, kid can blow up and yell, and, the next hour after they've calmed down, you still accept them, where it's not conditional. I think they need to see that, they have value independent of their outbursts and behavior. It's not like, oh, I'll interact with you pleasantly when you're pleasant to me. I mean, you hear that phrase, you got to give respect to get respect, but teachers need to give respect all the time, even if they don't get it. And I think that that's something that's often flipped, where we expect students to respect us before we can really respect them. So I think approaching students from, just a stance of unconditional, positive regard and unconditional acceptance can go a really, really, really long way. Because fundamentally, I mean, our job is to educate students. And, while we do that, we can certainly have a big impact on them. But, it really doesn't need to be as fancy and I think intimate as some teachers assume. I mean, we just need to be a presence that is just unfailingly there for them. And a lot of times we're there for them in terms of, hey, I noticed you're really struggling with this concept. Let me help you. Even if that's 20 minutes after they've screamed at us or had some sort of outburst. So I think that that's a way that we can, support students while, maintaining strong boundaries. Because in the end, we're their teacher. We're not their parent. We're not their friend. We're not their counselor. We're there to educate them. But we can do that in a way that affords them, dignity and compassion, and helps them see that, they can trust people. They can trust, if a student can trust me, then they can learn to trust other people. So I think that sometimes I think educators think, trauma-informed approach is a lot, fancier, or, it's just a lot more, they might think it's more difficult or complicated or touchy-feely than it actually is. I mean, I think it's about being, consistent, predictable, compassionate, non-judgmental, and accepting. And sometimes that's hard, because obviously some students are more likable than others. But, if you ask your students, who's your teacher's favorite, they shouldn't have a list of 3 people. They should say, wow, I can't tell, but I know she makes me feel good.
Right on. I think that's a really great place to land here. I hope that, we can say that all of our classrooms look like that, where they're safe, comforting. I like the idea, though, of, like you say, boundaries, because we can get caught up in things. And there's times where, I feel myself not going over that boundary, but I can see it in front of me and say, like, oh, it's like you just want to, some days, you just want to give a kid a hug, but like that's not the right thing to do, right? You're like, no, I can't. But, so I like this. This is a really great sort of distillation of sort of professional responsibilities and relational responsibilities too. So thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks for talking about it. And I mean, I'm really glad you had me on, because it is sort of a topic. I think the scary part is once you realize this is happening, and once you face it, you realize, wow, I have friends who were sexually abused as children. I've had students who've experienced this, And I have students right now that are going through this. And I think that's just a hard thing for adults to face, because we want to think that every child has a great home environment and every child's, safe. And, it's scary, but it's important to recognize that it's out there. And, especially if there's something to report or a child discloses, we need to be really, really good stewards of that disclosure and make sure that the part, when they go back and tell their story, about third grade, fourth grade, ninth grade, whatever grade you teach, what role did you play in their life? What did you say that they're going to remember and tell? Like my seventh grade social studies teacher, always complimented my work, and I just felt so important. I just felt like, wow, she notices what I do. She cares about what I do. And, we never had a personal conversation. This was just 100% her interacting with me about social studies, but it was something I remembered because she made me feel like I could do something good. And she came to the sentencing for my perpetrator, and she had just retired and said she cleaned out her classroom, and she had a picture of a project I had done in 1989.
Wow.
And it was just one of those things where it was authentic. It was genuine. It made a difference for me at that time. And when she sat there in the courtroom with me, when I was giving my victim impact statement, I just thought, you know what? She had no idea what was going on, and she didn't need to, because her practice and the way she educated her students was so compassionate and so caring. She really made a difference just by being an excellent teacher.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dani. And how can people get in touch with you or find more information on the kind of things that you're doing in this area?
Yeah, on Twitter, I'm at Dani Bostick, DaniBostick. I'm at DaniBostick@gmail.com. I've written a lot about this. I have 2 TEDx talks on it. If anybody's listening and has questions, about, relating to people who've been through this, or, maybe somebody's listening. A lot of times people are afraid of, child sexual abuse and dealing with it because they've been, victims themselves. And I think I fell into that category. I just couldn't face that it was happening to anybody because I hadn't faced that I had been a victim of it. So, I'm always available. And, I think sometimes people just don't know where to start or what to do. And, definitely I'm a resource for that.
Excellent. Well, again, thank you so much, Dani. This has been a really great conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
You bet. All right. Well, you take care, and we'll see you out there in the Twitterverse.
Yes. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye. This week's episode of Ed is brought to you by the Well Endowed podcast by the Edmonton Community Foundation. It's hosted by Andrew Paul and Elizabeth Bunkink and produced by Lisa Pruden. It explores the impact of passionate people who are working to make Edmonton a strong, vibrant city to live in. The Edmonton Community Foundation helps people create endowment funds, and the podcast tells the stories of how those endowments intersect with the community. If you'd like to know more, you can read the show notes and subscribe at thewellendowedpodcast.com. And as for this show, if you want to get in touch or you'd like to be a guest on the show, you can email me at theedpodcast@gmail.com or hit me up on Twitter at theedpodcast. If you want to listen to more of Ed, you can head over to the website, theedpodcast.podbean.com, or find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the podcatcher of your choice. Just search up Ed Conversations. Ed is a proud member of the Alberta Podcast Network powered by ATB. You can find this and all other member podcasts at albertapodcastnetwork.com. Ed can also be heard on VoiceEd Radio. It's 24-hour internet broadcasting devoted to the best ideas in education. Just head over to voiced.ca. So, on behalf of myself and Dani, thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you next time. Bye.